The year 1893 in New York wasn't like the history books tell you, all grand buildings and invention. For a boy like me, Thomas O'Malley, barely 12 summers old, it was mostly gray brick, the smell of horse manure, and the constant grumble of carriages on cobblestones. Our little corner of Greenwich Village was a maze of narrow streets, where gas lamps flickered like tired eyes at dusk, and shadows stretched long and hungry. My ma worked her fingers raw at the textile factory downtown, and my pa, well, he was. Mostly a memory and a fading photograph tucked into ma's worn Bible. So it was just me and ma in our cramped little flat, 3 floors up from the street, and right across from the place everyone whispered about, the Widow Blackwood's boarding house. It wasn't much to look at, just another brownstone, a bit taller and darker than the others, with a perpetually drawn curtain in the front parlor, window that seemed to hide more than it merely shaded. Mrs. Blackwood herself was a spectral figure, always dressed in black, her face a pale oval beneath a severe bun of graying hair. She rarely smiled, her lips thin lines, and her eyes, even from across the street, held a depth that made you feel like she was looking right through you, not at you. The neighborhood kids, me included, had all sorts of wild tales about her. Some said she was a witch, others that she simply never truly recovered from her husband's mysterious drowning years ago. Whatever the truth, an uneasy quiet clung to her house, like the perpetual dampness of a New York winter. It was late spring when the first peculiar thing happened, though at the time, I didn't connect it to anything untoward. It started with Mr. Silas Abernathy. He was a dapper gentleman, or at least as dapper as one could be after a long journey. He arrived in a handsome cab one blustery afternoon, a large leather trunk strapped to the back, and a smaller valise clutched in his gloved hand. He had a fine, well-trimmed mustache and a tweed suit, and he tipped the cabbie a nickel, which was a princely sum in our parts. I was perched on our stoop, whittling a stick into what I hoped would someday resemble a decent toy boat, watching the usual comings and goings. Most people who came to Mrs. Blackwood's were quiet, unassuming types, often recent arrivals to the city, looking for affordable lodging while they sought their fortunes or simply tried to make ends meet. Mr. Abernathy was different. He had a robust laugh when he paid the cabbie, a sound that seemed too jovial for the somber facade of the boarding house. He went inside, and I heard the heavy oak door creak shut behind him. For the next few days, Mr. Abernathy was a regular sight. He'd emerge in the mornings, sometimes with a newspaper tucked under his arm, and walk briskly towards the bustling streets of Manhattan. In the evenings, he'd return, sometimes with a parcel, sometimes just with the day's dust on his shoes. He seemed cheerful enough, often nodding a polite greeting to Ma if she was out shaking a rug, or even offering a small smile to me, though I was always too shy to return it properly. He had a way of whistling a jaunty tune, something about "Pop Goes the Weasel," and it echoed strangely in the usually silent street, a brief splash of cheer in the otherwise muted atmosphere. Ma even commented on him once, saying, "He seems a proper sort, that Mr. Abernathy, clean and quiet," which, coming from Ma, was high praise indeed. Then one morning, Mr. Abernathy didn't come out. The sun rose, the usual street sounds started, children shouting, vendors calling out their wares, but no Mr. Abernathy. Ma thought nothing of it. "Perhaps he's gone out early," she'd said, "or maybe he's feeling poorly." But by that evening, when the gas lamps were lit, and shadows once again claimed the street, and still no sign of him, Ma started to frown. "Strange," she murmured, pulling the curtain back slightly to peer across the street. "He's usually home by now." The next day was the same, and the day after that. It wasn't just that he was gone, it was that his presence had vanished entirely. No one had seen him leave. His trunk was still up in his room, or so we assumed, since no cab had pulled away with it. It was as if Mr. Abernathy had simply evaporated into the New York air. A week passed. The memory of Mr. Abernathy's cheerful whistle began to fade, replaced by the usual quiet of the boarding house. Then another new arrival. This time it was a woman, Miss Eleanor Finch. She was younger than Mr. Abernathy, perhaps in her late 20s, with striking auburn hair pulled back in a severe bun and intelligent, searching eyes behind a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles. She carried only a single satchel, her clothes simple but well kept. She arrived on a gray, drizzly Tuesday, her shoulders hunched against the damp, and she seemed to sigh with relief when Mrs. Blackwood opened the door to her. Miss Finch was even quieter than Mr. Abernathy. She was a scholar, I heard Ma tell. Our neighbor, Mrs. Flanagan, who ran the bakery on the corner. Miss Finch spent her days at the Astor Library researching, Ma said. We'd see her leave in the mornings, a stack of books often under her arm, and return late, her face often smudged with ink. She had a soft, almost imperceptible cough, and, sometimes late at night, I'd hear the faint glow of a lamp from her window in Mrs. Blackwood's house, long after the other lights had gone out. Miss Finch was a creature of habit. Every morning, precisely at 8 bells, she would emerge, and every evening, precisely at 7. This went on for perhaps 2 weeks. Then, just like Mr. Abernathy, she simply ceased to be. One morning, the street came alive, but Miss Finch did not appear. Her lamp remained dark that night. The Astor Library would have surely missed her, her unfinished research lying dormant on some dusty table. Again, no trunk departed, no farewells were uttered, no whisper of her leaving rippled through the neighborhood's grapevine. She was just gone. This time, a prickle of unease started to form in my young mind. 2 people, gone without a trace from the same house. It felt too coincidental, too neat. Ma, practical as she was, dismissed it. People move on, Thomas. New York is a big city. Perhaps they found better lodgings, or perhaps they simply left for other opportunities. But her voice lacked its usual conviction, and I saw her glance across at the dark, silent house more often, a worried crease forming between her brows. The whispers about Mrs. Blackwood started to intensify in the neighborhood. Mrs. Flanagan, at the bakery, usually a fount of gossip, only shook her head when asked, making the sign of the cross over her ample bosom. Even the gruff newspaper vendor, Mr. Henderson, whose voice usually boomed with the day's headlines, would drop his voice to a conspiratorial whisper when the widow Blackwood's house was mentioned. It became a macabre game for me, though I never admitted it to anyone. I'd sit by our window, pretending to read a tattered adventure story, but my eyes would constantly drift across the street, watching for new arrivals. And they came, a succession of them. First, a stout German merchant, named Herr Schmidt, with a booming laugh that briefly pierced the house's gloom and a love for strong pipe tobacco. He stayed for 3 weeks. Then, a quiet, pale seamstress, Madame Dubois, who always wore a lace cap and carried a worn sewing basket. She lasted only 10 days. A young, aspiring artist, Mr. Julian Vance, with paint smudges on his fingers and a hopeful glint in his eyes, occupied a room for a little over a month, his bright landscape sketches, visible through his open window on occasion, a fleeting burst of color against the drab brick. Each one, after a brief residency, simply vanished. Like smoke caught on a stiff breeze. No goodbyes, no forwarding addresses, no trunks being loaded onto cabs. Just absence. A profound, unsettling void where a person had been. The routine became chillingly familiar. The hopeful arrival, the brief period of their presence, and then the sudden, inexplicable emptiness. Mrs. Blackwood herself seemed utterly unfazed by these rapid turnovers. Her demeanor remained unchanged, stoic, reserved, always in black. She would occasionally be seen airing out a rug or polishing the brass knocker on her front door, always moving with a quiet, almost gliding motion, her presence as ephemeral as the guests she hosted. She never put up new signs for vacant rooms. Yet new guests always seemed to find her. It was as if word of mouth or some other unseen current drew them inevitably to her doorstep. The police were, of course, no help. Ma, brave soul that she was, had tried once, early on, after Miss Finch disappeared. She'd sent me to the station house with a note, explaining her concerns about the two missing residents. The officer, a burly man with a walrus mustache, had simply waved me off. People come and go in New York, boy. They don't report their comings and goings to the constabulary. Unless there's a body, there's no crime. He'd grumbled something about busy streets and private lives. His words, though meant to reassure, only fueled my growing suspicion. It was too neat, too quiet. Nobody simply vanished without a trace. Not so many. Not from the same address. Not in a city as bustling and sprawling as New York. It defied logic. And the silence, the profound, heavy silence that enveloped Mrs. Blackwood's house between guests, was more unnerving than any noise could be. It was the silence of a grave, a place where life entered but did not exit. My boyish imagination, fueled by penny dreadfuls and ghost stories, began to spin elaborate, chilling theories. Was Mrs. Blackwood selling their belongings? Was she a secret accomplice to some nefarious gang? Or was it something far more sinister, something supernatural, as the neighborhood whispers suggested? The winter of 1893 settled over New York like a shroud, biting and relentless. The gas lamps seemed to shrink back from the cold, their light weaker, and the cobblestones often glistened with a thin sheet of ice. My obsession with the widow Blackwood's house grew with the deepening cold. It wasn't just a game anymore. It was a nagging whisper in my thoughts, a dark shadow clinging to the edges of my vision. Ma worried about me, said I was spending too much time staring out the window, that I needed to get some fresh air, but the fresh air held no answers, and the cold made my ears ache. The answers, I felt, were across the street, lurking behind that perpetually drawn curtain. I started keeping a secret tally, etched into the rough wood of my windowsill with the point of my whittling knife. Each notch represented a guest who had arrived, and a second, deeper notch meant they had vanished. The list grew steadily. Mr. Abernathy, Miss Finch, Herr Schmidt, Madame Dubois, Mr. Vance. The names were a mournful litany in my head. There was a young Irish lass named Bridget O'Connell, who sang softly to herself as she walked to her work at a laundry, her voice like a tiny bird, until her song, too, was silenced by absence. Then a grizzled old sailor, Captain Peterson, who smelled of salt and stale tobacco, and who would sit on the stoop, even in the chill, whittling his own strange figures from driftwood. He was gone within a fortnight, his whittling unfinished. The pattern was always the same. Arrival, a few weeks of quiet residency, and then gone. No fuss, no belongings shipped out, no farewells. Just a sudden, startling emptiness. It was the lack of explanation that haunted me most. People didn't just disappear, not like that. Not so many, and not all from the same house. It was unnatural. Ma still tried to brush it off, but I saw the worry in her eyes. Sometimes she'd cross the street to the bakery and come back with news whispered low about Mrs. Blackwood, rumors mostly, that she kept to herself, never bought more than the bare necessities, never spoke a word beyond what was required. She was a ghost herself, they said, living in a house of ghosts. My observation post became my world. I knew the rhythms of that house better than my own. The precise time Mrs. Blackwood's lamp went out, the faint scraping sound she made when she cleaned the front stoop, the way the shadows danced on her parlor window at dusk. One evening, emboldened by a sudden rush of daring, I decided to do more than just watch. It was a bitterly cold night, the kind that stung your exposed skin. Ma was working a late shift, and the flat was quiet and dark. I bundled up in my thickest coat, pulled my cap low, and slipped out our front door. The street was deserted, save for the rhythmic clatter of a distant horse-drawn carriage. My breath plumed in front of me like smoke. My heart hammered against my ribs as I crossed the street, each footstep sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. The boarding house loomed, darker and more imposing up close. The brick was rough against my gloved hand as I crept along the low fence. I tried the gate, a faint squeak, and it opened just enough for me to slip through. The small patch of front yard was overgrown with brittle, winter-dead bushes. I hugged the shadows, moving slowly, towards the side of the house, where a narrow alley led to the back. There was no light from the back windows. The cold seemed to deepen here, pressed in by the tall, unforgiving walls of the house. I reached the back of the house, where a small, rickety wooden shed stood, smelling faintly of damp earth and something else, something metallic and faint that I couldn't quite place. Next to it was a door, presumably leading to the kitchen or a back entrance. It was old and weathered, the paint peeling in long, ugly strips. I tried the handle, careful to make no sound. Locked, of course. My disappointment was a bitter taste in my mouth. I felt silly, a small boy playing at detective. What had I expected to find? A secret entrance? A hidden cellar full of... what? As I turned to leave, my eyes caught something glinting faintly in the moonlight near the foundation of the house, partially hidden by a thicket of dead weeds. I knelt down, my fingers numb with cold, and fumbled in the frozen dirt. It was a small, ornate button made of brass, with a tiny, intricate design of a ship's anchor. My mind immediately flashed to Captain Peterson, the old sailor. He'd had a coat with buttons like that. I remembered seeing them when he sat whittling on the stoop. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran through me. Why would his button be here, buried in the frozen dirt by the back of Mrs. Blackwood's house? He hadn't just left. He'd been here, and something had happened. I pocketed the button, a cold, hard little weight in my hand, and crept back across the street, my heart still thumping, but now with a new kind of fear, one that felt more real and immediate than any ghost story. I couldn't tell Ma. She'd only worry, perhaps forbid me from going near the house again. But the button was proof. Proof that my suspicions weren't just a boy's wild imaginings. The next day, a new guest arrived. This time, it was a family. A stern-faced father, Mr. O'Connell, no relation to Bridget, though the name sent a fresh pang of unease through me. A quiet mother, and their two small children, a boy and a girl, no older than 5 or 6. They were clearly fresh off a boat, their clothes clean but rumpled, their faces pale with travel. The children, usually so full of life, were subdued, clinging to their mother's skirts. I watched them go in, feeling a grim premonition. The little boy had a small, carved wooden dog, which he clutched tightly. He dropped it briefly near the front steps, and his father, with a sigh, picked it up and handed it back. A tiny, insignificant detail, but it stuck in my mind. For a few days, the presence of the children brought an uncharacteristic, fleeting lightness to the boarding house. I'd hear faint giggles from inside, or the distant cry of the baby. It was a welcome change from the usual solemnity. Ma remarked, "At least they have children. Perhaps that will make the old widow smile." But Mrs. Blackwood remained as inscrutable as ever. I saw her lead the family out one afternoon to the market, her black figure gliding along, the children's small hands clutched in their parents' as they walked beside her, wide-eyed at the bustling street. They looked like any other, family making their way in a new city. Then, one bitterly cold morning just before Christmas, the boarding house fell silent again. No children's laughter, no sound of their small footsteps. The curtains remained drawn. I waited and watched. Ma waited and watched. No cab came. No family emerged, bundled against the cold. They were just gone. All of them. The entire family. The small wooden dog that the boy had clutched so tightly, the one he had dropped on the steps, it was gone too. This was different. Entire families didn't simply disappear. This wasn't just individuals finding better opportunities. This was an eradication. A cold dread coiled in my stomach. It wasn't just the disappearance of the family that terrified me. It was the way Mrs. Blackwood continued her quiet, undisturbed routine. It was as if she had simply wiped them from her ledger and from her mind without a single ripple of emotion. The house, usually merely silent, now felt like it was holding its breath, a dark, hungry entity across the street. The air around it seemed colder, heavier. I remembered the police officer's words. Unless there's a body, there's no crime. But what if there were bodies? What if they were hidden away somewhere within that silent house, beneath its floors, behind its walls? My imagination, already vivid, now painted truly gruesome pictures. I thought of the faint metallic smell by the shed, the missing buttons, the utter lack of belongings. It all pointed to something far more sinister than simple departures. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the floorboards in our flat sounded like a footstep in the house across the street. Every gust of wind rattling our window felt like a sigh from the unseen. The brass button of Captain Peterson felt heavy and accusatory in my pocket. I knew, with a certainty that made my hands tremble, that I couldn't just watch anymore. Something had to be done. But what could a boy of 12 do against a mystery so dark, so pervasive, and a woman so utterly unreadable? The idea of crossing that street again, of venturing into that house, filled me with a terror that was almost paralyzing. But the alternative, simply waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to enter and disappear, was even worse. The widow Blackwood's boarding house was a trap, and I was the only one who seemed to notice. The next step, whatever it was, had to come from me. The terror of that night, with the wind rattling our windows and the brass button of Captain Peterson a cold, accusing weight in my pocket, solidified my resolve. I couldn't just stand by and watch. But what was I to do? I was a boy, small for my 12 years, with no one to truly listen to my wild theories. The police had dismissed Ma. They certainly wouldn't heed a scrawny kid like me. I knew I had to be careful, as Mrs. Blackwood, though quiet, was not foolish. Her very stillness suggested a watchful presence, like a predator patiently observing its prey. The next few days were a blur of nervous energy. I pretended to play in the street, kicking a worn leather ball, but my eyes were always darting towards the boarding house. I noticed things I hadn't before. The way the delivery boys from the butcher or the baker never lingered, dropping their parcels quickly and hurrying away. The lack of flowers in the window boxes, even in spring. The unnerving silence. Most houses had the hum of life, a child. Crying, a piano playing, the clatter of dishes. Mrs. Blackwood's house was a tomb, even when it had guests. I started to devise a plan, foolish and desperate as it might be. My target was the wooden shed in the backyard, where I'd found Captain Peterson's button and sensed that faint, metallic smell. I needed to get inside. The problem was timing. Mrs. Blackwood rarely left the house for long, and if she did, it was typically a quick trip to the market, never more than an hour. I couldn't risk her returning while I was lurking in her backyard. Then, a stroke of grim luck. Ma fell ill with a nasty cough, and the doctor prescribed her a tonic that made her sleep deeply. She was confined to bed for a few days, and though I hated seeing her suffer, it meant my movements would go largely unnoticed. And then I overheard Mrs. Flanagan from the bakery chatting with another neighbor. Mrs. Blackwood had been seen heading downtown, apparently to visit a solicitor regarding some papers. "She'll be gone for hours," The way those lawyers drag things out, Mrs. Flanagan had said, shaking her head. This was my chance. My heart leapt into my throat, a mixture of fear and adrenaline. It was late morning, a cold, gray January day. I waited until I saw Mrs. Blackwood, a tiny black speck in the distance, turn the corner at the end of our street, her severe black coat pulled tightly around her. Once she was out of sight, I moved. I grabbed a small, rusted screwdriver from Pa's old toolbox, tucked it into my coat, and slipped out our door. The street was blessedly empty. I darted across, feeling like a phantom myself, and squeezed through the squeaky gate into Mrs. Blackwood's yard. The dead bushes scratched at my trousers as I made my way to the back. The shed stood there, silent and forbidding. The wooden door to the shed was old, the hinges rusted. I tried the handle again, still locked. I then examined the latch. It was a simple, old-fashioned bolt held by a few rusty screws. My hands trembled with cold and nerves, but I worked quickly, scraping away at the frozen wood around the screw heads with the tip of the screwdriver. The first screw groaned, then slowly turned. The second was harder, resisting stubbornly. I put my full weight into it, gritting my teeth, and with a final protesting shriek of metal on wood, it came loose. I pulled the bolt away, and the shed door creaked open, revealing a darkness that seemed deeper than the mere absence of light. A wave of cold, musty air, laced with that strange metallic tang, washed over me. I hesitated, my hand on the splintered wood. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to run. But the faces of the vanished guests flashed in my mind. Mr. Abernathy's hearty laugh, Miss Finch's studious eyes, the small, quiet family, the little boy's wooden dog. I swallowed hard and stepped inside. The shed was small, barely big enough for me to stand upright. It was choked with shadows, but a thin shaft of weak winter light filtered in through a crack in the roof, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the frigid air. My eyes adjusted. There were no bodies, no gruesome sights, at least not at first glance. Just gardening tools leaning against one wall, a few empty wooden crates, and a workbench littered with old tins and rusted nails. Disappointment, sharp and bitter, began to rise in my throat. Had I been wrong? Had my imagination simply run wild? Then, as my eyes scanned the floor, something caught my attention. In the far corner, almost hidden beneath a dusty tarpaulin, was a section of the wooden floorboards that looked different, newer, cleaner, as if they had been replaced recently. I knelt, my breath misting in the cold, and ran my fingers along the seam. There was a faint gap, almost invisible but definite. My heart began to pound again, a frantic drumbeat in my ears. This was it. I tried to pry the board up with my fingers, but it was too tight. I remembered the screwdriver. With renewed determination, I jammed the flat end into the narrow crack and twisted. The wood groaned, a faint, splintering sound. I twisted harder. With a sudden, sickening thud, one end of the board lifted. A wave of icy air, colder and fouler than anything above ground, rushed up from the opening, and with it, that metallic smell, stronger now, almost overwhelming. I peered into the blackness. It was a small, crudely dug hole, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. The edges were rough earth, crumbling inwards. And then, my eyes, now fully accustomed to the gloom, made out something else. Stacked against one side of the hole, partially covered by more dirt, were a few items. A small, tarnished silver locket, the kind a lady might wear, with a faint, almost invisible, initial E etched into it. Miss Eleanor Finch. My blood ran cold. Next to it, a small, faded child's shoe, worn at the toe. The little boy from the O'Connell family. My breath hitched in my throat. And beneath it all, partially buried, a crumpled, mud-stained piece of tweed fabric unmistakable. Mr. Abernathy's suit, It wasn't just imagination, it was real. They hadn't left. They had gone down. My mind reeled. What was down there, and how had they been convinced to go? The metallic smell was almost suffocating now, mixed with the damp earth. It was the smell of iron, of old blood, faint, but unmistakable. A wave of nausea washed over me. This was worse than any ghost story. This was something truly monstrous. I pulled back from the hole, trembling, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst through my chest. The horror of it clawed at me. Mrs. Blackwood wasn't just running a boarding house, she was running a trap. A silent, insidious trap where people entered and never left. The objects were not merely buried, they felt like offerings, grim trophies, of her chilling enterprise. I had to get out. I had to tell someone. But who? Who would believe a boy with a rusty screwdriver and a few trinkets from a hole in the ground? They'd call it a childish prank or a wild fantasy. And Mrs. Blackwood, that silent, unreadable woman, she would know. She would know I had seen, and then perhaps I would be next to disappear. I carefully replaced the loose floorboard, trying to make it look as undisturbed as possible, pushing the dirt and weeds back over it. I screwed the rusty bolt back onto the shed door, tightening it as best I could with my shaking hands. The whole time I was acutely aware of the ticking clock, the possibility of Mrs. Blackwood's return. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist. Every creak of the old house sounded like her footsteps. I scrambled back through the yard, through the gate, and across the street to our stoop, my lungs burning, my legs aching. I burst into our quiet, flat, breathless, and cold, pulling the heavy door shut behind me. Ma stirred in her bed, coughing softly, but thankfully didn't wake. I collapsed onto my own small cot, pulling the thin blanket over my head, but the darkness offered no comfort. All I could see were the ghostly faces of the vanished and the gaping black hole in Mrs. Blackwood's shed, waiting for its next victim. The brass button, still clutched in my hand, felt like a burning ember, searing into my palm. I had found my answers, but they were far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The real work, the impossible task of stopping the widow Blackwood, now truly began. The days after my terrifying discovery in the shed were a torment. Sleep offered no escape, only dreams of dark holes and pale, disappearing faces. The brass button, which I now kept hidden beneath my mattress, seemed to pulse with a silent accusation. Ma was still recovering, her cough subsiding but her energy low, so she noticed little of my growing pallor or my agitated spirit. It was a blessing and a curse. I was grateful she wasn't worried, but desperate to tell someone, anyone, what I had seen. But how could I? Who would believe me? And what if telling someone put Ma in danger? The thought of Mrs. Blackwood, that silent, knowing figure turning her attention to us, made my blood run cold. I started to think, really think, about how she did it. How did she get people to go down into that hole? Was it persuasion? Force? Some kind of trickery? I recalled the initial cheer of Mr. Abernathy, the quiet studiousness of Miss Finch, the desperate hope of the O'Connell family. None of them seemed like the type to willingly disappear or to be easily overpowered. There had to be something more, a method. My mind, though young, was keen, sharpened by years of observing the bustling, deceptive streets of New York. I began to reevaluate every small detail I had previously dismissed. The gas lamps that flickered in her parlor at odd hours, long after the neighborhood had gone dark. The occasional faint, almost musical sound I sometimes thought I heard from her house, like a distant, distorted chime, quickly vanishing. The way her curtains were always drawn, not merely for privacy, but as if to block out the world or to hide what was within. I decided my next move needed to be less direct, more cunning. I couldn't break into the house itself. That was too risky. But I could watch Mrs. Blackwood more closely, observe her patterns, her habits, searching for a crack in her impenetrable facade. I resumed my stoop sitting, whittling a new, unidentifiable piece of wood. But my gaze was constantly fixed on the brownstone across the street. She was meticulous. Every morning, she'd dust the porch railing. Every afternoon, she'd bring in the empty milk bottle. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical. She rarely looked up, rarely acknowledged anyone. She was a woman of routine, a creature of habit. And habits, I knew, could be exploited. One brisk afternoon, I saw a delivery man from the dry goods store approach her door. He knocked, a polite, firm rap. Mrs. Blackwood opened the door just a crack, slipped a few coins through, and took the small package, her hand barely visible. The transaction was swift, almost secretive. But as the door was closing, I caught a glimpse, just a fleeting second, of the interior. It was dark, almost unnaturally so, even in the middle of the day, and there was a faint, cloying sweetness in the air, like lilies that had been left too long in a stuffy room. It was a strange smell for a boarding house, one that stuck in my memory. A few days later, another guest arrived. This time it was a tall, imposing man with a neatly trimmed beard and a bowler hat. Mr. Alistair Finch. No relation to Eleanor, but the name sent another shiver down my spine. He carried a well-worn leather briefcase and looked like a man of business. He walked with a confident stride, a newspaper tucked under his arm. He knocked, and Mrs. Blackwood opened the door, a sliver of her dark form visible. Mr. Finch stepped inside, and the door clicked shut with a soft finality. I watched, for him, waiting for the familiar pattern to unfold. For 2 days, he emerged each morning, briefcase in hand, and returned each evening. He was less jovial than Mr. Abernathy, more serious, but still a visible, tangible presence. Then, on the third morning, he didn't appear. His room, which I could see from my window, remained dark. The newspaper he usually left on the stoop was absent. The subtle shift in the house's energy, the return to its usual deathly silence, was almost palpable. Another notch on my silent tally. This time, the disappearance didn't fill me with blind panic, but with a cold, hard determination. I needed to get inside that house. Not through the shed this time, but through the front door or a window, if I could manage it. I needed to see what happened to them. I needed to find a clue that the police, for all their skepticism, couldn't ignore. The opportunity came a few days later. It was a Sunday, and Ma, feeling better, had decided to go to church, something she rarely missed. She usually took me with her, but I feigned a headache, clutching my forehead dramatically until she, with a sigh, allowed me to stay home. "Be a good boy, Thomas," she'd said, pulling her shawl tighter. "Don't wander off," I promised, my heart pounding with deceit. Once she was gone, the quiet of our flat was immense. It was a strange, almost holy silence, broken only by the distant church bells. I felt a knot of fear in my stomach, but also a surge of fierce resolve. This was it. I crept to our front door, checked the street. Empty. The Blackwood house loomed, still and dark, a sleeping monster. I walked down our stoop and paused, looking for any sign of movement, any watchful eyes. Nothing. I crossed the street, my movements slow and deliberate, trying to appear as if I were just a boy out for a stroll. The front door of Mrs. Blackwood's house was heavy oak, dark with age, and the brass knocker was polished to a dull gleam. I tried the handle gently. Locked. I knew it would be. I moved to the side of the house where a narrow alley led to the back, just as I had before. This time I wasn't going to the shed. I was looking for a window. The windows on the ground floor were either too high or barred. But as I rounded the corner, I saw it. A small, narrow window, half hidden by overgrown ivy, that seemed to lead into what might be a pantry or a small scullery. It was slightly ajar, just a crack, probably for ventilation. Hope, thin but persistent, sparked within me. I clambered onto an old, overturned wooden barrel that sat nearby, stretching my arm towards the window. My fingers brushed against the glass, then the rough wood of the frame. It wasn't latched from the inside. With a careful push, the window swung inwards, just enough for me to squeeze through. I paused, listening. The house was silent, too silent. I slipped through the opening, head first, my feet scraping against the rough frame. I landed with a soft thud on the cold, tiled floor inside. The air was heavy, still, and that faint, sickly sweet scent I'd noticed earlier was stronger now, mixed with the smell of old wood and dust. The room was indeed a pantry, shelves lined with jars of preserves and sacks of flour, all covered in a thin layer of dust. I pushed the window shut behind me, careful not to make a sound, plunging the pantry into near darkness. I stood still, for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, listening for any sign that I had been detected. Nothing, only the slow, steady beat of my own heart. I took a deep, shaky breath. I was inside. The widow Blackwood's house,